Circumcision is practiced around the globe in various religions and cultures, but do we actually know where it originated? Do we know if this is something that simply developed as a human behavior, or is it something that was inspired by an off-world source, aka an alien connection? The reason I ask that is when I look at the history of circumcision, there's no singular origin for this surgical practice. Instead, there's a multitude of reasons, from a puberty practice to a coming of age practice to sexual dimorphism, all the way to religious purity, covenant relationship, and being a people set apart on the planet. So if there isn't just one location where the practice of circumcision, which is a medical surgical procedure, if there's no common root for where it came from, but it does apply to tribes around the world, isn't that a curiosity? I'm going to investigate this topic here at Shed Show Talk. Join the conversation by hitting the subscription button and the notification bell. Let's get into the topic. The Dogon are one of the oldest known tribes with extraterrestrial and differently explained history than most nations and most people groups on the earth. So the Dogon are definitely a tribe of interest, and they too have their own circumcision history. Now they tie circumcision to their creation narrative, which equates termites and anthills with male and female genitalia. In response to this, they do believe that children who are prepubescent are essentially androgynous. Now this does tie into their view of the gods and of course how they interact with humanity. Once an adolescent becomes a teenager, they essentially become defined as male or female. The Dogon understand their entire existence in connection to their gods and their deities. These are called the Pneumo and the Nomo. What I've learned through doing a previous video on the Dogon is that their godhead is actually a potentially amphibious alien from another planet who cannot reproduce itself and therefore does reincarnation by a biological process or a transfer of consciousness. So with the Dogon, their intelligence around the practices of gender clarification, reproduction, and essentially the cosmos, and keep in mind the Dogon understanding of the cosmos is so advanced that only recent astronomy has clarified some of their knowledge. They believe that their source for this knowledge came from an extraterrestrial alien source, that is their godhead. So please keep in mind when we look at the history of the practice of circumcision from the viewpoint of the Dogon, it is from an otherworldly source, and this is really quite key. Now there are some documents I read on different websites than the one I'm showing you right now that might suggest the Dogon could have been connected in part to the Egyptians. I'll take a look at that next. But when we refer to ancient alien technology, which a lot of people are very interested in, I can't help but continue to ask the question, how much of our practices, whether it's religion, culture, or in this case circumcision, could have been inspired by an otherworldly source? So in the Dogon religion, they saw life and death like shedding a skin. It doesn't surprise me then that there are some natural derivatives of that type of thinking, such as shedding a piece of skin for the purpose of clarifying reproduction. Because if you want to avoid death, reproduction is the key to that life cycle, particularly if there is an alien god that is amphibious and cannot reproduce itself, thus requiring a human connection because humans can reproduce. It's all a little circular, but quite fascinating. As a side point, you notice how in the Dogon tradition the serpent returns and the ram returns. These are ancient religious symbols that are tied to a lot of other cultures who were also impacted by circumcision or opposed specifically by people who practice circumcision, such as the Abrahamic faiths. Now, as a last note I want to point out in this document, you notice how I just highlighted liquid copper? In a few ancient alien technologies, you'll see reference to ancient copper or liquid mercury, but that's a little bit of a side point. If you want to dig into the Pneumo or any of this kind of stuff, Shannon Dory does a bunch of research, and also Laird Scranton. I referred to his work on a previous video. You can check that out in our links if you want to know more about this mysterious tribe in the Mali region of Africa. Next up, I'm going to take a quick peek at Egypt and see if there's a connection between these two groups, as Egypt does have some of the oldest information about circumcision. Egypt is absolutely fascinating. There are mysteries that the ancient Egyptians had that to this day we have not been able to solve. So of course, when the Egyptians practice something, it leads people to ask deeper questions, asking where did it come from? How did they discover that? Why did they invent this practice? And we know that circumcision was practiced by the ancient Egyptians, but what we don't know is why and how often and by whom. So for example, there's hieroglyphs, there's visual representation of the practice of circumcision in mummies that have been found, but there's no consistency as to who was circumcised and who was not, leading some to believe that possibly circumcision was an individual practice rather than a corporate religious or corporate cultural practice. Apart from one story where a ruler was circumcised with 150 individuals. So that was a mass circumcision. But again, no reason seemingly was provided, so it does remain a mystery. Now, when we consider that the Dogon and the Egyptians might, and I use the word might very carefully, they might have some kind of connection, then perhaps we have some more awareness as to how the practice moved throughout the continent. However, and that's a big however, Egypt did not have a singular source or reason for the practice of circumcision. Now, considering that circumcision is considered a surgical procedure, it's very curious that it developed without any major theology or doctrine or religious or cultural reason, that it simply seemed to occur from time to time. So as you look into some of the documents and do your own search, some have translated the act of Egyptian circumcision to be a remote experience, meaning it happened with individuals rather than with large groups. Some have said that it's not a religious practice, but actually one of pride. I even read where it was used as a show of being able to withstand pain. So there's multiple reasons as to why circumcision may have occurred within Egypt, but what we do know for certain is it wasn't a standardized experience. As a result, if we consider that some believe the Dogon tribe may have, and I say may have because it hasn't yet been proven, may have come from an Egyptian source, the Egyptians did not have an otherworldly inspiration for the practice of circumcision. Instead, it was either individual, sporadic, or particular around certain individuals. So in the Egyptian case, it appears that circumcision was not inspired by an otherworldly source, but perhaps by personal preference or personal experience, which is very curious. But this is entirely different for the Abrahamic faiths. Abraham is the patriarch of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. He is also the key figurehead in the history or the religious history of circumcision in the Abrahamic faiths. He practiced it himself, and it was then passed forward as an act of covenant. The term covenant is very important in Judaism. Typically, it is a bond between God and humanity, and God is otherworldly, meaning not originating from this planet and therefore alien to this planet. So the act of covenant is a bond and agreement between God and humanity, typically involving some form of blood ritual. Within circumcision, the blood is natural result of the surgical procedure. So when we consider Judaism and the Abrahamic faiths, there is a very strong statement saying that this practice is otherworldly. So to participate in circumcision is to participate in this ancient Abrahamic covenant. And to me, this is what's so wild. We have the Abrahamic faiths, which are largely the largest religious constructs in the world, talking about otherworldly connections as common, and that ties to their beliefs behind circumcision, marriage, covenant, and more. And yet, when we talk about the alien question, a terminology Stephen Bassett uses, people think that an alien construct is so controversial. But really, if you think about it, otherworldly intelligence is the basis behind most of the world's religions. It just means something not from this planet. So perhaps humanity is much more in tune with an alien connection than we might think. Now, when I say alien, I'm not referring to little green men or the standard gray alien. I'm simply referring to intelligence not from this planet. Isn't that a wild thought? Do you believe circumcision is alien or human? Let me know in the comments section.